Anyhow, let me. I'd just like to welcome to the stage, or to the court front here, Evan Smith and, of course, Sissy Farenthold.
Thank you, Joe. Sissy, how wonderful to see you.
Well, nice to see you again.
It's rare these days that you get to be with somebody who spent time in Texas politics who is purely about principle. So, and never is it more the case that I like to say that during a legislative session. You are the exception who proves the rule. I thought we'd do a little bit of background biographical stuff. People think they know you, and maybe they do, but maybe they don't know some of the biographical stuff, and I thought we would start there first and work our way from the back forward. So, born in Corpus, right?
In Corpus Christi.
Very different time. Corpus at the time, and for many years that you lived there, and even when you were elected to represent in the legislature, one of the poorest communities, not only in Texas, but in the country.
Was what?
One of the poorest communities, not only in Texas, but in the country.
That's the first thing I saw during the war on poverty, but for per capita, the three poorest cities in the United States were Corpus Christi, Laredo, and El Paso. Does that sound familiar?
Yes. A theme today, Sissy, may be how little has changed from those days. Well, that's so born in Corpus, your dad was an attorney. We heard a little bit about your father in the film. Grandfather, Dean Farnsworth, noted correctly, for whom the law library here is named. He was a professor at the law school.
And before that, he'd been a judge on the Second Appellate District.
Had been Chief Justice of the Civil Appeals Court, right? And had been a state legislator.
That's right. I would go up sometimes and look at his picture during my time here.
Right. So you went off to Vassar. Why'd you go to Vassar?
Well, for a 17-year-old's reason. I had some cousins from Dallas that had gone to Wellesley, and I was not in tune with them. And they were disparaging of Vassar as just a party school, and I thought that sounded wonderful.
The opposite of whatever they liked, right? That's it.
And so off to Vassar I went at 16.
16. And we heard graduated at 19.
Yes, because we were the only class to go through in 3 years. We were being trained for war.
Right.
So it was a very different time with a different outlook, I think, definitely. We were doing our own housework there.
Yes.
And as I mentioned, it was mentioned in the film, we were sort of it was said, you've got to do something because others are sacrificing so much.
Right.
It was a different environment. It sure wasn't a party school.
Yeah, after all, right.
No.
And any doubt in your mind that you would go on to law school? Any doubt you would go on to law school, given your family history?
It was really... I think I must have. I really wanted to be a foreign correspondent before that. I mean, of course, I followed the war as closely as I could as a little kid, and it was just sort of. It was there. The law school was there, and particularly when I became so conscious that the BA degree wasn't the end of it, through the atmosphere there, that I went the law way.
Yeah. Well, here at the law school, you were one of 3 women in a class of 800.
800. And it was also a very interesting time to be in law school.
You were class of 49, right?
Yes. And it was the class you see of people that were coming back under the GI Bill.
Yes.
So not on the race issue, but as far as economic issues were concerned, there were many people that were fortunate enough to be able to go to law school that probably wouldn't have beforehand.
Right.
Had a real cross-section leave the race out of it, because we were hardly in the vanguard on that.
Right. But I want to stay for a second with this idea of you as one of only a very few number of women in a very large institution, because that will come back to that theme again with the legislature.
It was the same thing.
What was it like at the time to be one of only 3 women here? How were you treated? How did you feel about the environment?
Well, I had 3 different ways of being treated. One was the fact. Let me see how I can put it. My grandfather taught here. Dean McCormick and others were in the class with my father. And Leon Green, for example, would call on me because he liked my voice. He had been here during my grandfather's time. So I never had any, there was never any embarrassment on my part among that.
Yes.
I also had a thing that when my father came to town, and he loved coming to the law school, and we'd go to the restaurant across the street and so forth, there were students whose attitude changed perceptibly toward me. When I'm saying students, I mean all males, some male students.
Right.
So I never was subjected to what some of the women were, because I can remember we shared the powder room with the staff women. There wasn't a place for...
Just for women.
For women, yeah. And sometimes I would find some of my colleagues in tears over what had happened.
Over the way they'd been treated.
Yeah, I had never had that experience personally. I had the kind of thing that was very irritating when I learned that some of the students were betting when I would be engaged. I was furious. Just furious, because that's not why I went.
Right.
But anyway, it was a very, very, it was totally different from any experience I'd ever had before.
Now, when you got out of the law school, you did not make a move immediately into the practice of law.
No, I went to my father's law firm and married soon after. And the interesting thing about that was then I had my family, 5 children, and my father kept my law license up all that time. He paid, I didn't know that till he told me. And then I saw him about 2 weeks before he died, and he said, "We'll find a nurse, and you're going to come back." It didn't happen because he died. And so he kept that up for me all those years,
right,
unbeknownst to me.
Right.
So actually, I had done some title work for my husband in that period, but I didn't really go back until I went to legal aid.
Yeah.
And that was another experience. That was, I call, a searing experience.
Talk a little bit about that, please.
I saw the powerlessness of the poor. I saw how they were, I felt abused and ignored. And yet here I thought all these years I was voting for Democrats who were doing the job. Well, they may have intended to, but it was hardcore poverty. And then I saw all the kinds of abuses. For example, the only way they could buy furniture was to buy it in crates. But they'd get it home and open, and things would be broken, and there was no recourse for them. I mean, just so many things, little things like the price for the bus would increase 2 blocks from the charity hospital. I mean, didn't someone know how much that meant to, how much, it was such a burden to add that 50 cents or whatever it was when they were taking a sick child. So I saw so much of that day in, day out. And one of the things was that so much of it went back to state government. And so I was called...
You made a connection between...
I made the connection right away. And that's why when people would say, well, I'd vote for a woman if she was qualified, I felt completely qualified from my own experience. And there was only one state official that would respond to my phone calls, and that was a man named Frank Mescal.
And he was?
He was in charge of credit or consumer. And people would be locked up and forced to sign, to extend their loan or whatever. And he was the only one that sent someone down from Austin to investigate these abuses. Outside of that, I might as well never have picked up the telephone.
Right. I mentioned to hear you say a moment ago that here I thought we'd voted for Democrats, and yet.
And yet there was this, it was... Nothing had happened. Nothing had changed, or very little had changed.
What made you think back then that Democrats might be the solution to the problems of your community or your state to begin with? Because there was nothing else.
That's all we had.
Right.
We had divisions within the Democratic Party for sure.
Right.
Big divisions there, but that was it.
Right. Okay. So you'd made the decision in 1960 maybe
Yeah.
a little bit earlier than that, but let's just call it 68. That was the year of the election to run for District 45.
And it was it was, I would tell the students when I was at Wells College, put some planning in your life. I
Right.
never put any planning.
Well, in fact, this was a very much a last minute, right?
It was the last
minute decision.
And what it turned out was that a group of lawyers, one that I'd been to law school with, and we'd had some cases when I was at legal aid, so he knew I was on my feet and verbal, I guess. But he called me the night of the deadline and asked if I'd run. Well, in a very traditional way, I asked two people. I asked my husband, and I asked my wonderful double cousin, Dudley Daugherty, whose daughter is here, what do you think of this? And they both said, run.
Were you asking for permission or
Yes,
forgiveness?
I was asking for permission. There's no question about it.
Yeah.
But they were both very supportive.
Yeah.
And so
It had not occurred to you before to run?
I thought it would, not for myself. I would read, there was a woman on the city council that the newspaper just made joke of all the time.
Right.
And I thought it would be at least 10 years.
10 years.
Before a woman on her own, not as the widow of somebody,
Right.
office holder, but on her own. Yeah, but once I announced, I never thought of that.
Right.
Happily. And then I had a woman reporter come to me the night of the election to say, I sure could have won a lot of money on you. Because as I said in there, it was a joke.
Right.
Or I even had a cousin that said, I'd support her if I thought she was serious. I mean, all these stereotypes.
People made assumptions about your motivations and all that.
Whatever.
Right.
That it was a kind of, joke. Anyway, it was a very, very interesting experience.
And a very different time in some ways, right?
Yes, and it was my first experience with a lobbyist. A lobbyist came in and said he had some money for me. It was $200, I think. I think that's my phone.
The rates have gone up, I want to tell you.
Yeah, they've gone up.
They have gone up.
He had $200 for me, but he wanted me to know it was illegal. I told him to get out of the office. I was so shaken, I didn't know how to act. I mean,
Yeah.
I was just beside myself.
Well, it sounds like you knew exactly how to act.
And so his boss, who had been my grader in law school but had gone to the greener pastures of lobbying, thought it was such a great joke because this particular employee of his had gone back to Austin and said, never send me to that woman.
Yeah.
That was the end of that experience.
So you get into the legislature in 1969, January 69. You are the only woman among the 150 members of the Texas House. You're it, right? Barbara Jordan is the only member of the Texas Senate at this point who is a woman. So there are two of you out of 181. You're the only one out of 150. What on earth must that have been like?
I don't know. You see, in a way, it wasn't much different than being 3 out of a thing of 800.
Yeah, maybe law school prepared
And all
you for
I
that.
thought is, and so many of my colleagues had moved on to more prosperous fields.
Yes.
So there was a connection. And the connection was, I thought, it's 20 years later and it's the same.
Yeah. Nothing has changed.
So it wasn't such a novelty. I think without question they didn't know what to do with me. The speaker, for example, told me that they'd really struggled long over what kind of tie to give me. You know, the speaker's breakfast,
Yes.
that thing, and
Yes.
the gifts, and everyone's feeling good. So they gave me a bow tie. Not a bow tie, but a string tie.
Right.
I mean, they spent a lot of time on that.
Worrying about what to do.
They really did.
Yeah.
And then, for example, on Valentine's Day, the poet laureate read me a poem. Now, that's not in the archival papers.
Is that right?
I think I disposed of it immediately.
It'd be nice to have that poem today.
Yeah, wouldn't it though?
It would.
I'm so sorry I did that.
Your politics at the time, as you say, Democrats were the only option, really, right, back in the day. But you obviously were not in sync with a lot of the people in your party. You were more progressive or more liberal, depending upon how you want to
that was
phrase
a great, probably disloyal, but I remember saying to whoever I was walking down the sidewalk in Corpus Christi, I said, it troubles me to be on the same ticket. And that was one led by Preston Smith
right.
and Ben Barnes. Period.
Yeah.
I'd seen enough.
They may have been called Democrats, but you didn't feel like
they were not where I was coming from.
Not where you were coming from. Well, I went back, Sissy, I went back and looked at some of the things that you did during your time in the legislature, and it's so interesting to consider, again, to come back to this idea of principle first, last, and always, right? So here are just a couple things I pulled out that I thought were interesting. So there was a resolution commending LBJ for his handling of Vietnam.
No, what the resolution was commending his administration, but including Vietnam.
Including Vietnam.
Yeah.
So it was the Vietnam part that kind of caught my eye.
Yeah.
So the resolution passed 149 to 1. Mm-hmm. You were the one. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Yes. That's one. In a move that has resonance right this very minute as we sit here, you introduced a bill that would have made first offense possession of marijuana a misdemeanor.
That's right.
Right?
And did I get static? I was the only one, I think, that the proponents came in to see.
Yeah. We're still talking about this now, right?
Yeah.
It's an issue that is
I guess we are.
as fresh as this minute.
Yeah.
You openly supported a boycott, the farm workers boycott.
By all means.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's still with us.
There was a lot of opposition to busing, and you were on the other side of that issue.
That's right. I said the Supreme Court had spoken on it, and that was it. And, you know, there was an article, I think, in the New Yorker that quoted me as saying, in East Texas, people would come up and ask me, not openly, but just there. And when I said what I did, I could see the vote walk away.
Yeah.
I literally could, but I couldn't make it.
Just, it's what you believed.
Yeah.
You called for the abolition of the Texas Rangers.
Yes. And I want you all to know there was precedent for that. John Nance Garner had considered it, and there was a representative named Canales from South Texas who had tried to do it.
Probably kin to the representative named Canales from South Texas now, I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah, Terry's.
The
kin.
family, probably.
Yeah.
So, and where it came from was by just hearing the fear that the people had down where I came from in Corpus Christi, and it was fear when an African American or a Mexican American heard that the Rangers are coming. I'd hear that as a little kid and the fear of it.
Right.
So, yes, it caused a turmoil, as you know.
But again, I'm moved to observe that many of the issues you're dealing with back in 68,
now the
69,
Rangers
70,
may be in
71.
charge of ethics.
Of ethics. Well, we'll come to that.
God.
We'll come to that. But the idea of fear of law enforcement in some non-white communities, the question about what how we should regard marijuana as criminal penalties or not.
To say nothing of ethics.
Ethics. Well, and let's come to that. So the thing, if there's anything that you did during that time that you're most known for, most associated with, it was introducing the resolution that called for the independent investigation of Sharpstown. Mm-hmm. And only 30 members of the 150 came to be known as the Dirty 30 supported the idea of an independent investigation. Could you talk a little bit about what you were thinking at the time? And surely you knew that you were pushing a great big rock, the great big rock of myth up the great big hill. But I want to understand a little bit better about how you viewed this challenge in particular compared to some of the others you took on.
I'll give you the personal thing on it.
Please.
I had voted for the first bill that would set up a state FDIC, was what it was about. And then I'd gone to see Bill Patman, who was in the Senate, because it was during a special session. Everything was going in a big hurry. And I went to him, and he said, that's a bad bill, the second bill. So here I was, I voted for one, voted against the other. You know, what's going on? What's happening? You know, what am I doing? I didn't know. And so I wanted to study, and this is on one level, and I had done this at Vassar, study a piece of legislation from the time of the social need through its implementation, through its challenge in the courts.
Yeah.
I mean, I had that kind of thinking. And so that was the personal basis I had. How do we govern? How is it that something like this can get through? I didn't know what it was going to be in one sense. That's one level. The other level was that this was something that came up, was in the newspaper, I think, the day that Preston Smith, his inauguration. It was a Republican, there were very few Republicans, but the Republicans took it and ran with it, and some of us Democrats were there too. And then they dropped it, and I've never known why they dropped it. But some stayed with us, and it was a mix. Some new Republicans that had come in, and some Democrats. So when the Republicans more or less dropped out, that's when it became a Democratic thing, but with some Republicans still staying, including Craddock.
Including the very same
It's what
Craddock,
happens
who
to
is-
you when you stay in one place too long.
Tom Craddock, in fact, just to do a small digression, Tom Craddock, who is the longest-serving member of the legislature now and maybe second in history, the
Yeah.
longest-serving member, he came in with you in
He
69,
came,
did he not?
And he came in, and he was part of the Dirty 30, I think,
Right.
the whole time.
Yeah, people forget that.
Yeah. He
Interesting.
did too.
Yeah. I'm going to move on.
But we'll move on,
Yeah.
yes.
So you made a decision, Sissy, to press for this investigation, and ultimately it was the catapult that got you into
Yes, and it
the decision to
had,
run for governor.
you know how the name came about. Someone in the gallery, as they were walking out after the vote,
Right.
heard a lobbyist say, "Those dirty 30 bastards." And so we dropped the last word.
Could have dropped,
We
you
became
could have dropped the
30.
first word, actually. It would have been a different deal, right? It's good you
So
dropped the
that's
last
how
one.
that's how the name came about.
Right.
And actually, it took me a long time to accept that something did come out of it. And what it was in the next term was the kind of reform.
Well,
supposes.
a ton of change over people in the legislature, for one thing.
Yeah,
Right?
oh, yeah, big
turnover, right.
And then Common Cause was down here. I was busy doing
Yeah.
other things, but Common Cause came in, and some reform legislation was passed. And what I understand from Fred Lewis is the bill that is applicable to the former Governor Perry's problems is part of that.
Origins go back to
Yeah.
that.
Yes.
So let's talk about that race just from a pure political standpoint, 72. So you had Preston Smith as the incumbent governor. You had Ben Barnes, who was the lieutenant governor at the time, had been speaker. He decided to challenge the incumbent governor in the primary. Mm-hmm. And Barnes at that time, people don't necessarily remember this, some may. Barnes was being talked about as not just the next governor of Texas, but the joke was not whether he'd be president of the United States, but what year, right? Barnes, the future for Ben.
Not only that, and I've often said, if I wasn't in the legislature at that time, if I was still in Corpus Christi reading what I had, the newspapers, and maybe hearing from people, I would have been a Barnes supporter.
Right.
He was the new face.
Yep.
And
he was young.
he was young and intelligent and with a real drive. There was no question
Right.
about that. And Bob Johnson told me an interesting thing, contrasting Muncher and Barnes. And Bob Johnson was the party.
Muncher was the speaker.
It was when Barnes was the
Right,
speaker.
right.
When Barnes was the speaker, every night before the session, Frank Irwin, Ben Barnes, and Bob Johnson, the parliamentarian, would meet. And they would plan what the next day was going to hold. And that was it.
Yep.
There were no surprises. Contrary to what Bob Johnson told me, that when we came in, the Dirty 30 came in the morning, he thought, what's going to happen today?
Right.
Because we were constantly agitating
Right.
on one level or the other.
So you had President Smith, the incumbent, you had Ben Barnes, the lieutenant governor, who challenged the incumbent governor of his own party, and you had Dolph Briscoe, who was a millionaire banker and rancher from Uvalde, who had run before.
And who kept some of his staff, I
Right.
later learned. The
But
whole time.
had run before and lost, so
Yeah.
he's in the race, and then you get in the race.
Yep. And I was not planning on getting in the race.
Right. These are three people who have effectively got a statewide constituency, two of them having run successfully, one having run unsuccessfully, but had a lot of money to get his name out there, and then there's you.
Yeah, and I wasn't looking to do it, and I thought we'd really gotten started on reform.
Yeah.
I really, maybe overblown, but I thought we had a toehold, and there's a person in the audience, Harvey Grossman up there, that was the one that finally said, go on and run.
Go ahead and do it.
But what was going on, yes, was the fact that Senator Yarborough hadn't decided whether he was going to run for governor, which he really wanted to, or the Senate, where he would have more resources.
Right.
And so I waited in deference to him.
Had he run, you would not have run.
I wouldn't have run for governor, for
Yeah.
sure. I'd have run for something else, but I wouldn't
Right.
have run for governor. And then just to add to the mix, members of La Raza Unida were suggesting I run for governor, and I said, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
So that's how it came
Yeah.
about.
So you get in this race, there are the four of you, and because there's four of you, nobody gets, it not has to be the case that nobody gets 50%, but in a
Yeah.
race with that many big names, in all likelihood, there's going to be a runoff, and you come in second. Briscoe gets about 43%, you get mid-20s,
Yeah.
and you defeat the incumbent lieutenant governor and the incumbent governor. You beat both of them in that race. Pretty great.
I was surprised.
Yeah. And probably not just you, right? So you get into this runoff with Briscoe, and I mean, among the features of this, he ended up beating you handily in the runoff, right? He beat
Yeah.
you. It wasn't really
54, 56% of it.
right, 54-46. Wasn't close. It was a margin, but
It wasn't a Lyndon Johnson kind of thing.
true. But I thought what was interesting and kind of resonant and reminiscent of the world of today, in some ways, he wouldn't debate you.
No.
Right? You wanted to debate him, and he would not debate you.
Yeah, and finally we had something in Dallas. But, well, I think and the thing that really irritated me, didn't have anything to do with him, was his manager had spoken at a college up in Arkansas, and it just happened, I went up there later, and the kids were so skeptical of me, and I said, what is it? And apparently this man had said, I'd just been put in as a stalking horse. Well, I'm not a stalking horse.
Right.
And I was really provoked.
So you get through that race. So Briscoe goes on to win the governor's office in the fall. Ramsey Muniz ends up running as the Raza Unida candidate, gets actually more than 6% of the vote, keeps Briscoe below 50%. That's not a common scenario in Texas or elsewhere.
See, and that's where I lost votes big time with La Raza in the race.
Yeah.
That
But
was much of my constituency.
much of your constituency. But you end up in the fall of 72, or a little bit before the fall of 72, your name is entered into nomination for vice president at the Democratic National Convention.
And that was what those first
That
shots
first
were.
shots of Joe's film.
And most of that film is destroyed, and somehow Joe Bailey found that film in Vanderbilt.
Is that right? Amazing.
It was amazing.
So how exactly did that come about?
It was lovely.
Yeah.
There were 3 students, and 2 of them I hope will be here tonight, or later. Tomorrow. They were students at Baylor, and they were good friends of my son George over here. And they took it upon themselves to put this thing out, and they went all the way up the coast of the Atlantic, that I'd be a likely or would be feasible candidate. And I paid no attention to it.
Right.
And I almost didn't go to that convention because I had sort of walking pneumonia by that time. We'd had a special session here. And then I thought, no, I'm going to finish this. I'm not going to be like Eugene McCarthy, who went off to the Riviera after that vote, one of the votes. So I went over there, and Gloria Steinem and Professor Galbraith and I would visit. I don't know what it was about. We'd had breakfast and so forth. And so then then I had a phone call from the National Women's Political Caucus, which I did not belong to at the time. It had just started 6 or 8 months before, a year before. And they said that Shirley Chisholm had decided not to run for vice president. That's the year she ran for president. Would I permit my name to be put in nomination for vice president? And I said yes.
Now, this is significant because although I believe 2 women had been in nomination for vice president, really it was sort of either incidental or accidental or inconsequential. In any case, you were really, you're not technically the first, but for all practical purposes, you were the first.
And so, yes, and I'll tell you a footnote to that, which I have to remember always. So there it was, and one of the things that happened, I was down on the floor because no one had told me that that was against procedure. You know, I was walking around speaking to people and so forth. So I come back, and it was a surprising vote, and there were some instances in Oklahoma. Albert, who was the speaker, had left to go, visit with his buddies. The same thing had happened with bumpers in Arkansas. And while they were out visiting, the women took over. And that's how some of we came in, and then finally Professor Galbraith came and asked that I move Eagleton's name by acclamation.
Right. So Eagleton finished first, you finished second.
I finished second.
And who finished fourth?
I don't remember. And this is
Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
Jimmy Carter, who 4 years later would not only be the nominee of the party, but would be the next president.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
What is forgotten, and I notice when people write, they don't realize or they don't remember. This was to be, we'd had the reform of the McGovern-Fraser things, which, by the way, that convention was the first time I went as a delegate. I had always been cut before. This was the first time I ever was a delegate.
Yeah.
So when I get back, I have a phone call from Judge Sarah T. Hughes. And she had helped me in my campaigns earlier. She'd sent women to help me when I ran for the legislature. So she called to remind me that in 1940, her name had been placed in nomination, but had been withdrawn before the vote, so as not to antagonize the man. I said, I'll remember that, Judge. She just wanted me to know that.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's all convoluted. I was the first that went to a vote.
It actually went through to a vote, right. So you come back out of that, you go back to the legislature, you decide to run against Briscoe again in the primary in 74.
And yes, and I want to say something about that because it was an issue. I almost brought it up before, but I'll say it now. It was an issue that was never understood. I knew how foolish it was to run against an incumbent in the second term. We'd had the example of Conley and Yarborough. However, in that collection of reform legislation that was passed in 73 was the one of challenging the governor, but it only could be done. You would only have standing if you were running yourself.
So you did this to press the case.
did it for the money part of it.
Right. Didn't necessarily know or think that you might be able to beat him, but you did it on principle.
I had to get the issue of money and campaigns out there.
Right.
And it was a terrible dilemma. It was a terrible dilemma.
You would have preferred not to run.
Yeah, I knew what it was going to be.
Yeah.
But that's the only way you had standing to challenge. No one else had standing.
Yep.
And it was never understood.
Now, your time in elective office ended shortly after that.
Yes.
And never to return to elective office.
No, because I saw that the whole money thing and all the money thing has gotten worse and worse.
So you went dark on politics 41...
I wouldn't say I went dark
40
on
years.
Politics. I went maybe dark
on running personally.
Running, yeah.
And you believe if you draw a straight line from there to now, is the world better as it relates to that issue? Better, worse, or no different?
Much worse.
Much worse today. Much worse in what respects?
And with the money.
But be a little specific about that.
All right, let me give you this.
Yeah.
I heard a former congressman being interviewed. He said, I could run a respectable race for $250,000. He said, today, with the cost of television and the rest of it, it's $2 million before I can start.
Before you can start running for Congress.
That's right.
Forget about president, where we're talking about each campaign this year having $1 billion or $2 billion or more
there
available.
It is.
Outside money, inside money.
Dark money.
Dark money. Right. And the legal system through Citizens United and other cases hasn't necessarily helped. In fact,
I think our system is in crisis.
Right. You think it's in crisis?
I really do.
Right. As you... You'll have an opportunity to talk about the big issues that have consumed so much of your time and attention over the course of these 2 days. I want to use the remaining time that I have with you before we have questions from the audience to talk about the legislature today.
Okay.
Love that you have that look on your face. So you may remember that back during the 72 campaign, the Texas Observer did a cover story about you, and the headline was "A Melancholy Rebel." Remember that? It was a great story. So when Calvin Trillin was here, you mentioned the New Yorker.
Yeah.
The New Yorker piece, in reference to that piece, Trillin wrote, "Anybody who seriously worked for change through 3 sessions of the Texas House of Representatives is fortunate to escape with a melancholy frame of mind instead of severe disabling depression." And I kind of thought, reading those words back in the early 70s, it is literally the case today.
Yeah.
Right? There's no difference at all. So when you look at this legislature, obviously there are more women than there were. Mm-hmm. There's a more diverse membership of the House and the Senate. But in a lot of ways, it's one-party control. Happens to be Republicans rather than Democrats. Before you had the Yarborough and the Johnson Democrats, today you have the Strauss and the Patrick Republicans, pardon me. That there's a divide in the Republican Party that is not unlike the divide in the Democratic Party back then, right? A little bit the same, if not totally the same.
I wouldn't put them qualitatively the same.
Well, no, you wouldn't, of course. But the point is, though, that even though there's one party, the one party is itself not entirely unified, right, ideologically. Do you think enough progress has been made? I mean, we're obviously at a point where many of the things that we were talking about back at the time, gender equality, LGBT issues, racial equality, civil rights, however you want to, whichever buckets you want to live in. Many of those same issues are still being litigated today.
And with some improvement.
Some improvement, but in some cases, people would actually argue that we're taking steps not forward, but backward. Some would say we're taking steps backward, not forward on those issues. Yeah. What is I want you to kind of give us your view of this world today, the political world, the leadership of the state, the legislature. Where do you feel good about things? Where do you feel not so good about things?
I want to bring up, I'm not evading the thing because I just find things so dismal today, though certainly in some things like, getting women elected or getting African Americans elected, it's
the evidence is there.
The evidence is there, and it's not worth belaboring.
Right.
But one of the developments that I didn't even know about, and I was shocked at my ignorance, was the creation and the development and the power of something like ALEC, which we haven't discussed yet today, the American Legislative Exchange whatever C is, conference committee, whatever. And I was going to ask you this. This business, which I think is just so destructive to our system of straitjacketing local government in the name of it being state authority that will be superior.
Right.
And is that an ALEC project? Are we seeing this in other states as we did Stand Your Ground and the restrictions on voters that ALEC was behind? Is there any indication that this thing of restricting local governments from either having an opinion on fracking or plastic, and if you live on the coast and you see what that plastic does to birds and fish, you understand why there's such an ordinance where they are such. Is ALEC into this, or has it been looked into?
I Sissy, don't know whether ALEC is into it. I don't know whether it wouldn't surprise me if ALEC was in it. But there's no question that of all the themes of this legislative session, it's the tension between the states, the state government, and the cities, in complete contravention of the message we've been hearing that we don't want government with its boot heel on our necks. So we don't like the federal government messing in our business, but we're perfectly happy to mess in the business of cities.
And the thing, you see, I'm a resident of Harris County, which is notorious for its pollution. And yet the one access we have, they're trying to, the state, Greason from Fort Worth, who's a big power, he's described as that. He supported Strauss and so on and so forth, is sponsoring this stuff, which has a 5-year statute of limitation and a total, if the county would win the case, they would be limited to $4.3 million in recovery. I mean, it's a disaster for an industrial site as Harris County is.
You're obviously still paying a lot of attention to this stuff.
Yes, that's 1794, I think.
Yeah, you even can cite the bill number.
Well, because I see this, as
right.
When I was there, the whipping posts were young students. I remember a bill that 5 would be a conspiracy of students, and there was all this focus on getting these students to behave.
Right.
Behave. And now it looks like it's these things of restricting local government. And that's why I just wonder. Well,
it's a big issue in this session. Let me ask you 2 questions about national politics, and then I'm going to take questions for you. We'll moderate a little Q&A with the audience. So I was talking to Jamie Galbraith before in the back about the fact that Bernie Sanders was just in Austin a couple of weeks ago. He's thinking about running for president, thinks that the idea that Secretary Clinton is inevitable is ridiculous and that there ought to be a challenge for her from the left. Do you agree with that? We're getting into this race.
It would be helpful to her.
Do you support her, or would you like to see somebody else?
At the moment, I'm supporting her, but I'm certainly open.
You're holding your powder dry there, right? Hmm? You're going to keep your powder dry.
No, I think she's never been my first choice, but it would depend on who was running.
Let me maybe ask the question from a different side. How do you feel about the Democratic Party today? Do you still consider yourself proudly a member of the party? Do you think the party is in a good place or bad?
I'm a member of the party, but I'm so far left that I'm probably tumbling off.
Are you? There's an edge there, and maybe you're falling off.
No, I think that the Republican and Democratic Party really has an issue with identity. And again, it goes back to the money. It goes back to the money. And the amounts it takes and the people that give it or use it, whatever.
Of course, Senator Sanders would say and has said that his party, your party, has the same problem. Taking a lot of money from big interests, that the parties are indistinguishable in that respect.
Well, I think, except to take the money is contrary to some of the policies that I think Democrats usually support. But there is a problem of identity there. And there's a problem of you elect Democrats and then what do they do? I can remember, and I don't remember the details of it, but it came through loud and clear with one of those bankruptcy laws that favored the credit card people. I
Yes.
think it was. And there you saw the Democrats going that way. I mean, when do you stand for principle? But again, it's become this thing of needing so much money.
That's the original sin.
Huh?
The original sin is all the money
I think
involved.
it is. I think it is.
If we're all ladies and
Excuse
gentlemen.
me.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
you know, for example, why do we have such long campaigns? They go on for a year. Why don't
Longer than I wish they only went on for
Yeah.
a year. They go on longer
Yeah.
than that.
I mean, and you know who's right in the middle of it? The broadcasting companies, because of the fortunes they make.
Right.
When once upon a time, weren't the airways supposed to be free and belong to the people?
Well, don't
Isn't
deny.
that naive?
On behalf of all my friends in the press, don't deny us our fun. You know, I mean, I'm with you to some extent, but then we don't have a microphone to circulate or a microphone in the aisle, but just use your outside voice. If you want to raise your hand, we'll be more than happy to have you. Oh, do you actually have a microphone? Well, I spoke too quickly. Unless we have somebody walk them around. Joe, you want to do that?
Joe, how long will this be?
We have about 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Does that work for you?
Yeah, you've been great.
Well, yeah, you've been great. It's living history to be with you, Sissy. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Let's hands up, and then we'll.
And you may have to repeat the question because I
That's
don't
fine.
hear.
No problem. Sir.
Just to underscore your guest's observation, one of the men that she slayed fairly number of years ago reminded us that when he set out to run for the presidency in 1976, which is now 40 years ago, not a huge span of time, Jimmy Carter had to find $250 from each of 20 states to qualify for matching funds, which was the only way in which he would be a competitive candidate for the presidency. And he would say that they almost didn't make it. So from 20 states at $250 a state to a $4 billion campaign in a 40-year period is about as strong a illustration of her point that that is the central issue of our time. Let me just say, as a New Yorker, I know you've been concentrating on the dismal state of Texas politics and Sissy's magnificent role, but for us back east, she's an international symbol, a person who's provided leadership on a wide range of global issues, one of the most inspiring figures of our time.
Thanks, Ham. Sir.
Sissy, I'm proud to have served with you, and it just warms my heart to see that you're being recognized in this way. I now live in Georgia, and much of what you see going through the legislature here is happening, or just happened in Georgia. The legislature just shut down about a week and a half ago. ALEC is there, just like they're here, and all of those issues, everything that you can think of, the bad stuff is coming out of ALEC. And what's so dangerous is that they have gone to every state and gotten these ideologues to introduce those regressive bills that in too many cases have been passed because the rest of the Republicans are afraid to vote against anything that one of them proposes because ALEC will put money against them. And that's scary because now we have state legislatures that are bought and paid for by one entity.
One entity.
In the nation. So we no longer have a government by the people, for the people. It's by ALEC for ALEC.
Well, and in fact, Sissy, to the questioner's very reasonable observation about Georgia, the fact is redistricting has made almost all of our elections in Texas non-competitive, so that, to the questioner's point, the primary is, for all practical purposes, the general election. And all anybody has to fear is being challenged from your own party. Now, back then, was redistricting, Sissy, as much of a concern then, when the Democrats were in charge rather than the Republicans? Was it as bad back then?
Was it as bad?
Redistricting.
See, I'm going to say I don't think so. I think it's been brought to an art form now, if you want to call it that, the way they can do. So I don't think so. I wanted to introduce Curtis Graves, who just spoke, who was part of the Dirty 30.
Former member, and will be on a panel tomorrow, right?
He did a wonderful thing once when we were in session.
Once.
No, but
Just
this
once.
particular one, when you made a point by jumping up on the press table.
Yeah, nobody jumps up on the press table anymore. Well, they moved the table. One of the many problems with the new way of doing things. We have one over here. Ma'am?
Yes, with respect to the financing of campaigns, of particular concern to me is that we have judicial elections. That we have judicial
elections.
Oh,
Judicial.
yeah.
That judges are elected, not just in this state, but in many other states. And I think that that's an area of potential hope, because judges do not have to be elected. It's particularly concerning when they seek money from the attorneys who will appear before them in court. And as an attorney myself, and someone who has fought for the vulnerable, people who are in low-income, minority populations, I just don't see the judiciary serving for them. Do you see any hope in changing that system where judges are no longer elected?
What do you think about that? No longer electing judges?
Well, I'm right there, I think. And I don't know. I'd like to take a look at what other states have done. There's something about one election. I don't know. There are variations on how to handle this.
Right.
And I abhor what we have now. But I'm not conversant enough with different examples to say one is better than
Well, this is a bipartisan issue. One of the big advocates of no longer electing judges is the former Republican Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court, Tom Phillips. But, of course, it took him being out of office and not having to run to be an advocate for that. So, okay. Other questions for Sissy? Sir, in the back, right there.
I think that's my nephew.
Hi, Sissy. It is your nephew.
Oh, hello.
This really is a hometown crowd, isn't it?
So I just wanted to follow up on a point you've been hammering on about the influence of money on politics. But I also wanted to ask you what you feel like has changed in Texas over the last 40 years, that back in the 70s that someone like yourself could make a strong run for governor. Jimmy Carter won Texas in 1976, but no Democrat has carried the state in the presidential race since then, and no Democrat has won state office in over 20 years. So what has changed in the culture of Texas besides the role of money?
Right. Why are the Democrats in such a bad place in Texas for these last 20 years?
I think it's two fronts. I think, for example, the problems with the Democratic Party, and I'll cite one thing, which is a distressing figure for me to even recite. In this past election, there were 600,000 women in Harris County, which is where Houston, that were registered that didn't vote.
Well, and in fact, Wendy Davis lost Houston, lost Harris County in the election.
Yeah.
Right.
So, and I think it's that people don't feel that things are being even said that relate to them.
Well, let me try to go at that a little bit to take the point that was just made.
And by the way, he's
your
an
point.
editor of The Independent in New York City.
Oh, is that right?
We've spread out.
Okay, good. We have the worst voter turnout in Texas over the last 3 election cycles of any state in the whole country. 27 million people in this state now, 19 million adults, 14 million registered. We didn't turn out but about 4 million people in the last election. And the issues couldn't be bigger. They're getting more complicated, more complex. The population of the state is not only growing, but it's changing. And the soon-to-be majority populations are turning out at a much lower rate than the coalition of the descendant is deciding elections in Texas right now. So what do you do about that? So just to pick out one thing, the Latino population will soon be in the majority in Texas, but the Latino population famously does not turn out.
Not here, they do in California.
But so why do they turn out in California and don't turn out in Texas? Because it is assumed, not certain, by the Democrats in the state that their time back in power will correspond roughly with when Hispanics in the state turn out in adequate numbers. Not a guarantee, but it's assumed. So how do you get the Latino population to turn out?
Maybe it's the candidates you have. I don't know. I really don't know. I can remember when a man named Mario Obleda left here and went to California and was, I think, the first Hispanic in the cabinet, in the California cabinet. And he worked on voter registration, and it responded. And so I don't know. Are the candidates? Mm-hmm. You know, maybe it did. Maybe it has.
Well, the other theory that you hear often from Democrats who are dejected by the state of things in Texas is that we're running fake Republicans as opposed to real Democrats, that people need to run as real alternatives. Do you think that's a problem?
There was, and I think it was Fred Lewis, who's here in the audience, could speak more to that. I think there was actually polling that showed that the Hispanic believed in the system, but it wasn't responsive. The party wasn't responsive to their needs. I don't know. Is Fred here? Maybe he'll be back. But
hey, Fred.
He's familiar. Fred?
Yes.
Okay. It's all yours. You know more than I.
Well, you and I have often talked about how the Democratic Party here and other people don't really talk to the education needs and the health care needs and the economic needs of a lot of people. It's very hard sometimes to tell what the different parties stand for and what really matters to them. It gets sometimes lost in the campaigns.
I mean, you take the issue of, and I thought at least we'd hear Garnett Coleman, I think, has introduced legislation, but we haven't put any kind of demonstrated effort on the matter of Medicaid.
Well,
one issue.
This is a case where elections have consequences, right?
Yeah.
So you put people in power who don't want to expand Medicaid, and the numbers are there
and
to
there
avoid
was
doing
not a
it.
campaign issue.
Right. Well, in the governor's race, I think it sort of kind of tried to be, but didn't get very far. Anybody else got another question? Back there. We're about 5:30. Why don't we take one more, Joe?
One
is that okay?
more.
In the very back. Sissy says one more, therefore there shall be just one more.
And often it's the one I can't answer.
Okay. That's always the great regret is don't ever take the last question. That's it.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, ma'am.
Hi, Sissy.
Hi.
Do you think, perhaps present company accepted, that the press bears a real responsibility?
Include the present company. That's fine.
No, bears a responsibility for not educating the public on what the real issues are and who stands for what in this now method of he said, she said, which has nothing to do with what the actual facts are and the issues.
Did you hear that? Do you think does the press have any responsibility in not educating the public and therefore making the problems you're talking about worse?
Well, I think, and I wouldn't generalize on the press. There are different parts of the press. There are reporters, and there are editors, and then there are owners. So I think you have to break it down that way. It's often things that are published don't get to it, but where the fault lies, I can't say. I mean, I've known reporters that are really into things, and one way, reason or another, they don't get published. They have to give it to someone else. That thing. No, I don't think, and again, if you look at these questions that have been asked people, political literacy is just about It's a minus. And I don't know what's going on in the schools about whatever the civics class is. There's just no understanding of the system we're supposed to have. Now, that's only one aspect, but it's there.
Everybody, let's give Sissy a big hand.
Oh, I enjoyed it too. You're a great guy.